May 1943. Over the skies of northern France, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, tracking what should have been an easy target. An American fighter, grotesquely fat and ungainly, lumbering through the air like a pregnant cow. His pilots had been calling it the Fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. A joke, an insult to the elegant, deadly machines of the Luftwaffe. Galland lined up his shot, preparing to add another kill to his impressive tally of over 100 aerial victories. Then, the impossible happened. The American fighter, this supposed clumsy behemoth, suddenly rolled inverted and dove. Not a panicked dive, but a controlled, high-speed maneuver that took it from 25,000 feet to near ground level in seconds. Galland tried to follow, pushing his 109 into a dive, but within moments, his controls began to stiffen. His aircraft, which handled beautifully in a turning dogfight, became sluggish and unresponsive at high speed. By the time he pulled out of the dive, the American was gone, simply vanished. Galland returned to his base, shaken. He'd been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. He'd faced the best the RAF had to offer during the Battle of Britain, and in all those years, he'd never encountered anything like this. That evening, Galland sat down and wrote a detailed report. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was not the joke his pilots believed it to be. It was fast, possibly faster than the 109 in level flight at high altitude. It was heavily armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred a German fighter in seconds. And most disturbingly, it seemed to be nearly indestructible. Reports were coming in from other units of P-47s returning to base after absorbing damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. Galland's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The P-47 represented a serious threat. Luftwaffe tactics would need to change immediately. German pilots could no longer rely on the superiority they'd enjoyed for the first years of the war. If they tried to fight the P-47 using conventional dogfighting techniques, they would die. He sent the report up the chain of command to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Galland expected immediate action, orders to disseminate new tactical guidelines, perhaps authorization to accelerate development of new German fighters to counter the threat. What he got instead was silence. Then, a week later, a summons to Göring's headquarters. What followed was one of the most surreal and infuriating conversations of Galland's career, and it marked the beginning of his transformation from loyal officer to internal dissident, a man who would spend the rest of the war trying desperately to save the Luftwaffe from the incompetence and delusion of its own leadership. Hermann Göring was, by 1943, a caricature of his former self. Once a decorated World War I flying ace and a charismatic leader, he had devolved into a vain, corrupt, drug-addicted megalomaniac. His opulent lifestyle, his obsession with looting art from occupied territories, and his refusal to accept any information that contradicted his worldview had made him a liability. But he was Hitler's oldest and most loyal lieutenant, and his position was unassailable. When Galland arrived at Göring's estate, he was kept waiting for hours. When the Reichsmarschall finally appeared, he was in a foul mood. The strategic bombing campaign by the Americans and British was intensifying. German cities were being pounded night and day. And Göring, who had famously promised that no enemy bombs would ever fall on German soil, was feeling the pressure. Galland began his briefing. He described his encounter with the P-47. He presented intelligence reports from frontline units. He laid out the technical specifications as best they could be determined: speed, armament, rate of climb, combat radius. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The P-47 was a formidable opponent, and the Luftwaffe needed to adapt immediately. Göring listened, his face growing redder with each word. When Galland finished, there was a long, tense silence. Then Göring exploded. "This is defeatist propaganda," he screamed. "The Americans cannot build airplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades, but fighters? Impossible." Galland tried to interject, to present more evidence, but Goering cut him off. The entire report, he declared, was American psychological warfare designed to demoralize German pilots. The P-47 was a crude, heavy machine built by a nation of shopkeepers and mongrels. It might look intimidating, but in the hands of Germany's superior pilots, it would be swept from the sky. Galland, choosing his words carefully, pointed out that he himself had engaged the P-47, that he had seen its capabilities firsthand, that it was not propaganda, but observable reality. This was a mistake. Goering's face went from red to purple. "Are you questioning my judgment, Herr General? Are you suggesting that I, who commanded fighters in the Great War, do not understand air combat?" Galland knew he was on dangerous ground. In Hitler's Germany, contradicting a superior, especially one as powerful and vindictive as Goering, could be fatal. But he pressed on. "Herr Reichsmarschall, I am simply reporting what I have observed. The P-47 is a serious threat. If we do not adapt our tactics, we will suffer unnecessary losses." Goering waved his hand dismissively. "You worry too much, Galland. The Luftwaffe is invincible. We have the best aircraft, the best pilots, the best tactics. These American bombers and their escorts are temporary inconveniences. Once our new jets are operational, we will sweep them from the sky. Now, I have more important matters to attend to." Dismissed. Galland left the meeting in a state of disbelief and rage. He had presented facts, hard data from combat operations, and been dismissed as if he were a hysterical child. But Goering's attitude wasn't unique. It was pervasive throughout the Nazi leadership. The ideology of German racial and technological superiority had created a cognitive wall that facts simply could not penetrate. The Americans were inferior. Therefore, anything they built had to be inferior. It was a circular logic, immune to evidence. And Galland knew, with a sinking certainty, that this delusion was going to cost thousands of German lives. In the months following that disastrous meeting, Galland watched his worst fears come true. The P-47 Thunderbolts, flying escort for American bomber formations, began to appear in ever-increasing numbers, and they were slaughtering Luftwaffe fighters. The tactics that had worked so well against the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were proving suicidal against the Thunderbolt. German pilots, trained in the art of the turning dogfight, would engage the P-47s at medium altitude. The Americans, following their doctrine of boom and zoom, would refuse the engagement. Instead, they would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine gave it overwhelming superiority. From that altitude, the Thunderbolts would dive on the German formations with terrifying speed. The attack would last only seconds. A high-speed pass, 8.50 caliber machine guns blazing, and then the P-47 would zoom climb back to altitude before the German pilots could react. If a German fighter tried to follow the Thunderbolt into the dive, he would find his controls stiffening, his aircraft becoming unresponsive at high speed. By the time he pulled out, the American was already back at altitude, ready for another pass. It was a form of combat the Luftwaffe had no answer for. The German fighters, optimized for agility and turning performance, were being systematically destroyed by an opponent who refused to fight on German terms. The loss rates were catastrophic. In the summer and fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Every week, Galland received reports of experienced pilots shot down. Men who had survived years of combat, who had dozens or even hundreds of kills, were being killed by American fighters flown by pilots with a fraction of their experience. The difference was the aircraft and the tactics. A mediocre pilot in a P-47, following the boom and zoom doctrine, could kill an ace in a Bf-109 or FW-190 if the German pilot made the mistake of engaging on the Americans' terms. Galland tried repeatedly to get the high command to acknowledge the problem. He wrote report after report. He presented statistics. He brought frontline pilots to briefings to describe their experiences. The response was always the same: excuses, denial, and accusations of defeatism. Goering insisted the problem was not the enemy aircraft, but the quality of German pilots. They were becoming cowards, he claimed, unwilling to press home their attacks. He began to question the courage and fighting spirit of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, the same men who were dying in droves trying to defend German cities from the relentless Allied bombing campaign. The breaking point came during a staff meeting in late 1943. Göring, frustrated by the Luftwaffe's inability to stop the American daylight bombing raids, launched into a tirade. He accused the fighter pilots of cowardice and incompetence. He claimed they were abandoning the bombers, refusing to engage the enemy. Galland, who had attended the meeting along with other senior Luftwaffe officers, finally snapped. He stood up and, in front of the entire room, called Göring a liar. He described in brutal detail the conditions the fighter pilots were facing. Outnumbered, outgunned, flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The pilots weren't cowards. They were heroes fighting an impossible battle while their own leadership buried its head in the sand. The room went silent. No one spoke to Göring like that. Several officers expected Galland to be arrested on the spot. But Göring, perhaps recognizing that removing his most capable fighter commander would be a public relations disaster, simply glared at Galland and ended the meeting. From that moment on, Galland was a marked man. Göring and his cronies began looking for any excuse to remove him from command. But Galland didn't care anymore. He had seen the future, and it was written in the contrails of thousands of American bombers and fighters darkening the skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe was doomed, not because it lacked brave men, but because it was led by fools and fanatics. In February 1944, Galland's worst predictions came to pass in the most devastating fashion imaginable. The Allies launched Operation Argument, which would come to be known as Big Week. It was a coordinated, massive assault on the German aircraft industry designed to achieve absolute air superiority before the planned invasion of France. For 6 days, waves of American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and the new P-51 Mustangs, pounded aircraft factories across Germany and occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, throwing every available fighter into the battle. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. The combat was apocalyptic. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe launched over 200 sorties against the American formations. The German pilots were brave, pressing their attacks with suicidal determination. But they were facing an enemy they simply couldn't match. The P-47s, flying high cover, dove on the German formations with brutal efficiency. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns created a wall of lead that shredded the lightly built German fighters. A single burst could tear the wing off a Bf-109, a 2-second burst could set an FW-190 ablaze, and the P-47s themselves seemed nearly indestructible. German pilots reported pouring cannon fire into the big American fighters, seeing hits register, and watching in disbelief as the P-47s simply absorbed the damage and kept fighting. Galland personally flew multiple missions during Big Week, leading from the front as he always had. On the third day, he engaged a formation of P-47s escorting bombers over Brunswick. His wingman was shot down in the first pass. Galland himself narrowly avoided being killed when a Thunderbolt appeared out of nowhere, its guns tearing through his left wing. He managed to break off and escape, but it was a close call. That night, examining his damaged aircraft, Galland counted over 30.50 caliber bullet holes. If even one of those rounds had hit the fuel tank or the coolant system of his liquid-cooled engine, he would have been dead. The realization was sobering. He was one of the best fighter pilots in the world, flying with over 15 years of combat experience, and he had nearly been killed by an American pilot he never even saw coming. By the end of Big Week, the statistics were catastrophic for Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost over 350 fighters and nearly 100 bombers. More importantly, they had lost over 250 pilots, many of them experienced veterans who could not be replaced. The German aircraft industry had been dealt a crippling blow. Factories that produced fighter aircraft, engines, and components had been destroyed or heavily damaged. It would take months to recover, months Germany didn't have. The Americans, by contrast, had lost about 250 bombers and fewer than 30 fighters. And every single one of those losses would be replaced within weeks. The production pipeline from American factories was limitless. Galland wrote yet another report, this one even more urgent than his previous warnings. The Luftwaffe, he stated bluntly, had lost the battle for air superiority over Germany. The industrial and material advantage of the Allies, particularly the Americans, was so overwhelming that no amount of tactical brilliance or pilot bravery could overcome it. The P-47, which had been dismissed as a joke just a year earlier, was now the dominant fighter over Europe. And there was nothing Germany could do about it. Goering's response was predictable. He accused Galland of defeatism and ordered the report buried. But by this point, even Goering couldn't completely ignore reality. The skies over Germany were darkening with Allied aircraft. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition it could never win. By late 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. The Allies had successfully invaded France. German forces were retreating on all fronts, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was a shadow of its former self. Pilot losses had been so severe that new pilots were being sent to frontline units with minimal training. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot might have had 200 or 300 hours of flight training before seeing combat. By 1944, many had fewer than 50 hours. They were being thrown into combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. It was, as Galland described it, sending lambs to the slaughter. The P-47 Thunderbolt was now ubiquitous in the skies over Germany, and it had been joined by even more advanced American fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which combined the Thunderbolt's firepower with even greater range and speed. German pilots who survived their first few missions learned quickly: never, ever try to turn with the American fighters at low altitude. Never try to outclimb them. Never let them dictate the terms of engagement. But for inexperienced pilots, these lessons came too late. The attrition rate for new Luftwaffe pilots was horrific. Some units were losing 50% of their new pilots in the first week of combat. Galland, who had been promoted to general of the fighter arm, responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, was in an impossible position. He had the authority on paper, but no real power. Goering interfered constantly, issuing contradictory orders and refusing to allocate resources where they were needed. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, demanded miracle weapons and final victories. Galland was expected to defend German airspace with an ever-shrinking force of poorly trained pilots flying aircraft that were outclassed by the enemy. In November 1944, Galland did something unprecedented. He organized what came to be known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. Along with several other senior fighter commanders, he drafted a letter directly to Goering demanding changes. The letter was blunt to the point of insubordination. It stated that the current leadership of the Luftwaffe was incompetent, that Goering's refusal to accept reality was costing German lives, that the constant interference from the high command was making it impossible to conduct effective operations, and it demanded that either Goering step down or give the fighter commanders the autonomy to run operations without political interference. The letter was signed by some of the most decorated and respected fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills between them, men who had risked their lives for Germany countless times. Goering's response was immediate and vicious. He called the signatories traitors. He threatened them with court-martial and execution, and he removed Galland from command, effectively ending his operational career. Galland was devastated, but not surprised. He had known the risks, but he and his fellow pilots had reached a point where they could no longer remain silent. Too many good men were dying because of incompetent leadership. Too many lies were being told to the German people about the state of the war. Someone had to speak the truth, even if it meant career suicide. Galland was placed under house arrest, forbidden from flying combat missions. For a man who had lived and breathed aerial combat for his entire adult life, it was a kind of death. He sat in his quarters, listening to the reports of Allied bombers pounding German cities, knowing that the Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, unable to do anything about it. In the final months of the war, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. German cities were in ruins. The economy was shattered, and the Luftwaffe, what remained of it, was flying on fumes, literally. Fuel was so scarce that training flights had been almost entirely suspended. New pilots were being sent to combat with virtually no preparation. In a last desperate gamble, Galland was allowed to form an elite unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was, in many ways, the aircraft Germany should have had 2 years earlier. It was fast, over 100 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter. It was heavily armed. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was deadly. But it was too little, too late. Germany was out of fuel, out of time, and out of pilots. Galland's unit flew a handful of missions, achieving some success, but it was meaningless in the grand strategic picture. The war was over. Germany had lost. And the Luftwaffe, once the most powerful air force in the world, had been annihilated. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Galland, along with thousands of other Luftwaffe personnel, was taken into Allied custody. During his interrogation, American and British intelligence officers questioned him extensively about the war, about German tactics, and about the leadership of the Luftwaffe. Galland was brutally honest. He described Göring's incompetence, Hitler's interference, and the systemic denial that had plagued German leadership. When asked specifically about the P-47 Thunderbolt, Galland's assessment was unequivocal. It was one of the best fighters of the war. We underestimated it completely. Our leadership dismissed it as crude American engineering, but it was anything but. It was fast, tough, heavily armed, and produced in numbers we could never match. The pilots who flew it were well-trained and disciplined. They exploited its strengths and avoided its weaknesses. By 1944, encountering a formation of P-47s was a death sentence for inexperienced German pilots. The American officers pressed him. Why didn't German leadership recognize the threat earlier? Galland's laugh was bitter. Because they refused to accept reality. They believed in German superiority with religious fervor. Any evidence that contradicted that belief was dismissed as propaganda or defeatism. I tried to warn them. I tried multiple times. But in the Third Reich, telling the truth was considered treason. When the final accounting was done, the statistics painted a picture of total German defeat in the air war. The United States had produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. At peak production, one Thunderbolt was rolling off the assembly line every single hour. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering expertise, produced about 36,000 single-engine fighters total during the entire war, across all types. And German production was constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. The Americans, safe behind two oceans, could produce aircraft unmolested. The kill ratios told the same story. In 1943, when the P-47 first entered large-scale combat, German fighters still achieved rough parity. But by 1944, the P-47 was achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or higher. American pilots were better trained, flying better aircraft, supported by better logistics. The attrition rate for Luftwaffe pilots became unsustainable. In 1944 alone, Germany lost over 13,000 aircrew, killed, wounded, or missing. That's more than the entire pre-war strength of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, and they couldn't be replaced. The training pipeline had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant new pilots got minimal flight hours. The experienced aces, men like Galland with hundreds of kills, couldn't be everywhere at once. They were being slowly worn down in a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. The P-47 was the steel-tipped spear of that campaign. Along with the P-51 Mustang, it systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe. Not in a single decisive battle, but through relentless, grinding attrition. German cities were pounded into rubble by bombers escorted by Thunderbolts. German fighters were shot down by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The industrial capacity of Germany, already stretched thin by the two-front war, was systematically dismantled. The P-47 also excelled in ground attack, a role it took on increasingly as the Luftwaffe ceased to be a meaningful threat. In the final year of the war, P-47s ranged across Germany and occupied Europe, destroying trains, tanks, trucks, supply depots. Anything that moved. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. The sound of the P-47's distinctive R2800 engine became associated with death from above. German soldiers learned to fear clear weather because it meant the Jabos, the fighter bombers, would be hunting. Adolf Galland survived the war and lived until 1996. In his later years, he became friends with many of his former enemies, including several American P-47 pilots. He attended air shows, gave lectures, and wrote extensively about his experiences. When asked about the biggest mistakes Germany made in the air war, his answer was always the same. Arrogance. We believed we were superior, and that belief blinded us to reality. The Americans weren't supposed to be able to build fighters like the P-47. They were a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics. But they took their industrial genius, their engineering knowledge, and they built an aircraft that was perfect for the kind of war they needed to fight. And they built it in numbers we couldn't imagine. Galland's story is a mirror to that of men like Admiral Canaris and Albert Speer. Men who saw the truth, who understood the mathematical reality of Germany's strategic situation, but who were trapped in a system where truth was subordinate to ideology. Canaris tried to warn about American industrial capacity and was dismissed. Speer knew Germany couldn't win a production war and remained silent. Galland recognized the P-47 as a deadly threat and was called a defeatist. In all three cases, the Nazi leadership's refusal to accept reality sealed Germany's fate. The Third Reich was built on a foundation of lies, racial superiority, ideological purity, the inevitability of German victory. These weren't just propaganda. They were articles of faith believed with religious fervor by Hitler and his inner circle. When reality contradicted those beliefs, reality was dismissed. Intelligence reports were ignored. Officers who spoke uncomfortable truths were punished. The entire system was designed to reinforce Hitler's delusions, even as the Reich burned. Galland's particular tragedy is that he was a patriot. He loved Germany. He believed in defending his homeland. But he was clear-eyed enough to see that Germany's leadership was driving the nation toward destruction, and he was powerless to stop it. His warnings about the P-47 were just one example. He also warned about the futility of Hitler's offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. He warned that converting the Me-262 jet into a bomber instead of a fighter was strategic insanity. Every time, he was ignored or punished. The story of Adolf Galland and the P-47 Thunderbolt is a study in the collision between competence and ideology. Galland was, by any measure, one of the finest fighter pilots and commanders of World War II. He understood aerial tactics, aircraft performance, and strategic reality. But he served a regime that valued loyalty over competence, ideology over truth. And that regime was defeated not by a lack of courage or fighting spirit, but by its own willful blindness. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the physical manifestation of everything the Nazi leadership couldn't accept. It was built by a diverse, democratic society. Its production line employed women, African Americans, immigrants, the kind of people Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior. And yet, this mongrel society built over 15,000 of these fighters. They built them well, they built them tough, and they built them fast. The German response should have been immediate adaptation, new tactics, new aircraft designs, new training protocols. Instead, the response was denial and accusations of cowardice. The Luftwaffe was expected to fight the American industrial juggernaut with inadequate resources and obsolete tactics, all while being told that victory was inevitable if only they had sufficient will. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster is exactly what they got. Galland tried to change the system from within. He tried to inject reality into the decision-making process, and he was crushed for his efforts. His story is a reminder that in authoritarian systems, telling the truth is an act of rebellion, and rebellion, no matter how necessary, is punished. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most important but overlooked stories compelling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of moments where courage meant speaking truth to power, even when that truth was unwelcome. Adolf Galland's warnings about the P-47 Thunderbolt were vindicated by history, but by the time reality could no longer be denied, it was too late. The lesson is timeless. Ignore your enemy's capabilities at your peril. Dismiss uncomfortable truths at your own risk. And never ever confuse propaganda with reality. The P-47 wasn't supposed to be a great fighter. It was too heavy, too crude, too American. But it helped destroy the Luftwaffe and won the air war over Europe. Because in the end, physics and mathematics don't care about ideology. And the Thunderbolt was the reality that shattered the Nazi fantasy of invincibility.